No, he's not getting away with this again.
Chanel, no!
Happy birthday!
Oh, you're so old. Look at those wrinkles. She used to be so pretty.
All right, Kat.
So, you're in school, which means a party can happen?
Yes, please.
On it. See ya.
A party?
Do you mind? It's Kat's idea. She was messaging about it last night. But if you don't want to, I...
Hey, chill. I was just surprised. It's your birthday. You should totally have a party.
Hey, up you.
Hey, Val, I made a safeguarding report.
Stella's just emailed me, yeah.
Great, okay. Do you need any more information? Because I'm happy to type something up.
Sure. But just to manage your expectations, Amy, where there's no disclosure from the child and no evidence of harm.
But there is harm. What, because she doesn't have bruises? Like, come on, Val, you know I've been there.
I know, mate. Coral said you'd had some news. Do you think maybe you might be a bit sensitive? Look, it's been logged, and from now on, I will be watching.
So, evidence of harm. That's what you need.
Yeah.
Right.
Hello?
Amy Spratt?
This is Chanel Collins. You messaged me.
Yeah, hi, Chanel. Thank you so much for getting back to me. I'm sort of in a lesson right now, but can I call you back? Or we could meet after school.
I'm here now.
What?
Your message said you taught at Waterloo Road. I'm outside.
Chanel.
Amy,
I'm really sorry, but you can't be here.
you said Jared had a new girlfriend, that you were worried.
Yeah, that's true, but there are procedures we need to follow.
You said it was important. I came all this way.
Yeah, I know, I'm so sorry, but let me walk you to the end of the road and we'll figure out a time to meet and we'll talk properly. So, Chanel, this your girlfriend?
She's in sixth form, yeah?
No, Chanel, please.
She needs to know.
Like it's Kat's problem I'm cancelling my birthday party.
What the?
Jared Jones.
Chanel, please, this is only going to make things worse.
You his new girlfriend?
You leave her out of this.
Who are you?
Why didn't you ask him?
My stalker, she's mental. Doesn't want me with anyone else.
Too right. She's on to you, you know. I'm gonna tell her everything. How you're a controlling, lying narcissist who kicks off when anyone stands up to him.
Yeah, you're gonna tell her everything.
Wendy, I need help. I'm in the sixth form. There's an intruder.
Well, I'm not an intruder.
Now, Chanel, please, you need to leave.
But I haven't even told you anything yet. I haven't even spoken to...
I know, it's okay. Come on. Come on. It's all right.
No, he's not getting away with this again.
Chanel, no! Chanel! Okay. Jared. It's his nose.
See? Nothing's going on. Noel just sends stupid gifts. I think you're just stressed. Of course you are. Look at what happened. That awful girl.
I'm not an idiot, Libby. If I'm thinking this, there's got to be a reason. You want a complete set? Is that it? Screw Dean and his clown sidekick too?
No.
Then delete Noel's number now.
No, this is mad. No.
Jared!
It's ruined.
I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. Today's been... I've got a spare one at home. Just go get it.
I think I might go back to mine tonight.
Right. You're upset. I mean, you broke your phone. I got beaten up by my stalker because of what you told the teacher.
I told you I didn't say anything.
You showed her that video of me helping you. You haven't even asked if I'm okay.
Jared.
It's like, that's why all this is happening. Because of what...
I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen.
Libby, I just wanted to...
I don't think I'm meant to talk to you, miss.
Okay, then just listen.
Come on. Libby.
I just didn't want you to get hurt, you know that, right?
But I got hurt. Because of you.
Yeah, maybe, but it's less than you deserve for committing domestic abuse.
Domestic abuse?
What?
You're talking like we're married. Jared's 17.
Yeah, and good looking, and charming. And something like that could never happen to someone like you, right? But one day, you will realise it is happening. And you've got no idea how to make it stop. So when you need me, I'm only a phone call away.
Do you know how dramatic you sound?
Yeah, well, drama teacher. Oh, I used to be.
What?
Get Mrs. Drake.
Nah, no need. I'm going. Libby, you take care, please.
No one can believe it. Stay says hi.
Yeah. Jared. That girl. Why did she start harassing you?
I knew Sprat got in your head. Domestic abuse. Really, Lib?
No. I just wondered.
You were here all last week. Was your dad worried about you? Your sister? You really think they'd be okay with you basically living with me if I was so awful?
No, but
I mean, I get it. I care about you. That's scary. No one's probably cared about you for years, so you're testing me, seeing if I'll back off like everyone else did.
I'm not testing you.
Well, what'd you call interrogating me like this? Are you trying to make me angry or... I'm not. It's just sad, Lib.
God, Jared, I'm sorry. I just... You're right. Amy got in my head. Could I get that phone? Jared,
What?
could I get that phone? I want to call Kat.
Sorry, couldn't find it.
What, you're going out?
I got attacked today, Lib, in case you didn't notice. I mean, people around me who aren't constantly wondering if I'm a good person.
But it's my
Can
birthday.
you stop making this all about you? Yeah? Just for once?
Jared.